This video is to show how I'm going to do a conversion of a Nikon D50 DSLR camera from stock, which means that it had this filter in here that blocked UV light and infrared light, and going to replace it with one that is completely clear. Now, it's already actually been done once, but I left it with no filter at all. So what I did was remove this, and it was the first time I'd ever done anything like this, and well, the camera works. But there was one little connector that I was unable to get reconnected, so I'm going to have to desolder basically it's a shield plate, so that I can get to it, and then I'll have to resolder it back on. The reason to do this in the first place, at least for me, is because this filter blocks out a fair amount of light that would come from nebula, like for example the North American Nebula. What it amounts to is on the red end of the spectrum, this filter was designed for just standard daylight photography. If you want it for astronomical photography, you would want it to pass all visible light 100%, but this kind of does a curve. It starts low on one end, goes up high in the middle, and then comes back down low again. So at the extreme end, where you have, say, hydrogen alpha type light, it does come through, but instead of say 100%, maybe it's only 10% or 20%. It's a very small amount. Now, the disadvantage here, since I'm doing this, is it's going to be called full spectrum. It's going to let in all the ultraviolet light and all of the infrared light, which the reason that can be an issue is focus is the main thing as far as astronomy. If you're I'm going to do some daylight pictures too. I've already taken a few. You can do infrared photography, and I do have a filter that it's called a 720 filter, and it's 720 nanometers, and what it amounts to is that filter lets through just a tiny bit of visible light and then a lot of infrared light. So when I put that filter over the lens, I can't see anything. It just looks like I'm looking through it black, but the camera can see it. Now, if I point it up at, say, a light bulb, I can just barely see the light bulb. Okay, so the reason that I want to go ahead and put this clear filter in primarily is for help with dust particles, because right now a lot of people would say I have a naked sensor, but it does have a piece of glass over the sensor. It's on there, I'm going to say permanently. I guess it's possible to remove it, but it wouldn't be easy, and I wouldn't want to remove it. But when dirt gets on that sensor, or on that piece of glass, it's closer to the imaging sensor, so the dirt shows up far more in the picture. If I have this piece of glass in front of it, then the light can kind of cut around it, and the piece of dirt or dust particle is farther away from the sensor, and it doesn't hurt it as much. You might not even realize it's there in some pictures. I've got a miniature screwdriver kit here that I'm going to use. You can buy one of these for a few dollars at Walmart or any computer store or whatever. It's just like very small Phillips head screws. And one of the things to remember, the screws that I have to remove are not all the same length. So I'm going to draw a little diagram on a piece of paper, just kind of a rough diagram of the camera, and I'm just going to write down a number for each one I take out. Like for example, there's screw there, screw there, screw there. There's about half a dozen of them or so here on the bottom. So I'm going to put a number for each one, and then I'm going to tape each screw individually to a piece of paper and write the number next to it, just to try to make sure I don't mix them up. That worked good for me before. So I've drawn just kind of a rough draft here of the bottom of the side of the camera. Got my battery door and tripod socket. Just, you know, to give myself an idea. And I've counted 12 different screws, so I've just numbered them. I got my 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. They go all the way around. So there's several of them. And then I'll tape each screw individually to this piece of paper and write the number by it. Now, I learned how to do this by watching YouTube videos, mainly of a Nikon D50 camera being taken apart. I found one video in particular that I liked real well, and I just watched that thing over and over and over, and I thought, man, I can just open this thing up and do it. And of course, I got a few surprises. The first one I got was, even though a D70 and a D50 are very similar to each other, they have the same imaging chip in that. They're both 6 megapixel. It's not quite the same look inside there, so I had to do a little stopping and thinking, but it was still the same basic idea. It's just once I opened it up, some of the stuff looked different. And also, as long as I'm on the subject, this camera is like $50 or so. I found a real good deal on one used. So I mean, I'm not taking a huge risk with it. You can get them professionally done, which, I mean, if I had a really expensive camera, I don't think I'd want to tear into it myself. I found this replacement piece of glass clear filter on eBay. Really, I got lucky. It's just persistence. This is approximately 25 millimeters or 1 inch in height, and then the length here is about 29 millimeters. And I managed to find one on eBay after a lot of searching. Just one day there it was. And the thickness may be different though. This here, I tried to measure this one here with a set of calipers, because you have your piece of clear glass here, and then this blue glass is a separate piece of glass that's somehow glued or something by the factory. And I estimated it to be 1.6 millimeters thick. The one I bought is supposed to be 2 millimeters thick, so we'll see how that works. Now, if you decide to do this to your camera, of course you're taking a risk. You know, this is an old camera, so I don't have to worry about warranty, and like I say, I've only got about $50 or so in it. So the first thing you do is remove your battery, which in my case, it's already out. So I don't have my battery in there, so you want to make sure that's gone. And once I'm in there, there's a couple of different capacitors in there. One of them's for the flash, and you got to be careful about not touching those. You don't want to get shocked, and you don't want to make a spark across something either and mess up a circuit board. So the first thing I'm going to do is use my very tiny screwdriver here to remove these 12 screws, and then I'm going to tape each one of them down with Scotch tape to my piece of paper here so that I can remember which one's which. Okay, so I've removed each of the screws, and I went in order. I'll show you a little close-up of my diagram. So as you can see, I've drawn a very rough draft here of the bottom of the camera, and I just numbered, you know, I looked at the bottom of the camera, seeing where each screw was before I even removed any of them, and just numbered them. And then when I removed them in order and taped each one to the Scotch tape. And one thing I found that helps, when I go to tape it down, each screw, I lay the piece of Scotch tape sticky side up and press the screw down to the tape, and then flip it over and kind of do my fingers on both sides and make sure it's secured under there, and I have the number next to each one. Okay, hopefully that's in reasonable focus. As you can see, these screws are quite a bit different in length. Number 12 there is pretty long, number 10 and 11 are very short. These are only like a 1/16 of an inch long. This one's maybe a 1/4 of an inch or so. So that's one of the reasons why I numbered them. You want to make sure you put each one back in the right spot. I was able to use the same screwdriver on each one of them for this. So now the real fun begins. If I remember right, I was able to open up this battery door and very gently lift. Ooh, look at that, it pops right up. And there's no wires even connected to this part. So next, I'm going to have to remove 3 screws here on the left side of the camera, looking from the back. I've got one down here at the bottom, and there's 2 up at the top. And the one way up at the very top, you might feel like you don't have to remove it, but I'm thinking I did have to. And the same over on the other side where the memory card panel is. I believe I'll have to remove all 3 of those. Okay, so now I have very carefully removed the 3 screws on the left side, the 3 on the right side. I also had to pull out my memory card because it kept me from lifting this piece off. And I remembered that, I don't know how well you can see it, but there's a little, it's just a ground screw, I think. It's here on the bottom side, on the left side. When you're looking at it from the back, looks like a little brass or copper tab sticking out here. And I removed that screw. So I've removed a total of 19 screws. And I believe I can lift this up. Now, there's going to be ribbon cables and such under here. And it comes off. And see what's connected. Okay. So there's one connected here to the back of this plate. And I'm trying to remember if I was able to just leave this laying backwards or if I actually had to unplug it. I'm going to study that for a minute. So in order to remove this back panel, I had a ribbon cable here, a little connector that connected up here at the top. And I'll try to get a close-up of these. What it amounts to is these little cables, they only have a connector on one end. What it amounts to is it comes out here, and if you look real close, you can just see that you have all your little terminals, and it slides in like this underneath here, and you just got to make sure that you slide that in completely and square. You don't want it whopper jawed. So like if you imagine this card's the cable, you don't want it tilted like this or this. It has to be flush, square, and go all the way in. And it only maybe goes in a 1/16 of an inch. And then there's a tiny little lever basically that you flip over, and I lifted it up with my fingernail. It's easier to see with reading glasses. I'm not sure that I could even get it in focus zoomed in with the camera, but I'll try to get some still shots of it if I can. And then on the next piece, this here's the metal shield that I had to remove. It's got like a, I think what it does is it prevents interference, electrical interference from this monitor on the back from getting through to the imaging chip. And there's a tiny little cable that goes underneath this plate and plugs in. And when I took it apart the first time, I got it out with no problem. It slid right out. But I couldn't get it under, and that's because the connector is actually underneath this. So when I put it back together, I'm going to have to see if I can desolder this. This thing's just soldered on at a couple of points or so for a ground, basically. And so then I should be able to reconnect that. And that particular cable controlled the flash and the autofocus stuff on the lens, automatic metering and focusing. So I didn't have that. When I got this put back together, the camera functioned, but there was no flash. And if I tried to use the light meter, I couldn't use the light meter. So I was totally manual, which for astrophotography I didn't really care. I could still set my exposure times and all that, I just couldn't meter them. So hopefully I'll get that back, but through a telescope, you know, I'm manually focusing anyway. And when I use like my 300mm lens and 200mm lens, those are old manual lenses, I just set them on infinity. And then I've gone out and done a little bit of full spectrum photography, and I just focused manually. Okay, so now once I've removed this back panel, I have the next one inside, of course, which I showed you, it has this ground shield and what have you. And it had screws on each corner, so there's 4 there, and then there's 2 more, one there and one there, I believe. And then plus I had to remove a little cable over here, and the one over here was already disconnected. And now I can gently fold this back. And if I remember right, I did leave this thing like this before, because next, see if we can get in a little closer. So as you can see, now I've got this circuit board here just flipped backwards, and it's connected with a little ribbon cable, and I've just left it there, trying to make it so I disconnect as few things as possible. And next, okay, for starters, this thing, it looks like a battery. That thing's a capacitor. That's for the flash. And I believe there's another capacitor down under here somewhere on the left. As you can see, this here's a ribbon cable that I disconnected. This is the one that goes to the front of the camera that goes underneath that panel. I've got one here up at the top that goes up to my top little monitor that shows the film speed and the shutter speed and all that. And then there's one here on the left. And then I've tried to leave this one here connected. There's one there. And then this wire bundle, I've left it connected. So I'm going to have to remove these 3 what appear to be large, they're not really that large, screws, and this will allow me to lift out the imaging chip. So I removed the 3 screws on the corner, and that flips back, and there it is. There is your sensor. Right there's the shutter to the camera. And there are 4 tiny little screws on the corners that hold down a cover that your internal filter, that blue one or the clear one like I have, goes under. And there's actually 2 pieces there. There's one here that's kind of like a spring, which I'll show that to you as I get it off. So the next thing I'll be doing is removing these 4 screws. And like I say, there's, right now you're looking at the sensor, and it has its own built-on piece of glass on it from the factory that made the sensor, Sony or whoever. And this bugger right here, the blue one from the factory, was laying right there underneath this cover, and that blocked UV light and infrared light, and it was made just to give you nice daylight color that Nikon wanted their pictures to give. These 4 screws are the ones that hold down the little cover that your filter glasses in. Those are like the smallest screws you'll ever have. So I've removed these 4 really smallest screws you've ever seen. First thing that comes off is this hold down clip, which is kind of like a spring. And then next, it's just a little plastic cover. This here is where the this covers up the glass. So you put the filter glass in here, this blue filter glass, or in my case I'm going to put a clear one, stayed down in this little slot, and then this was on top of that, and then this baby with the little tiny spring held that down on there. Okay, I think I'm relatively well in focus. I don't know how well you can see it on here since everything's colored black, but it's easy to see when you're looking at it. There's just a little recessed area there where your piece of glass sets in, and so it'll fit right in there if you have the right size glass. So next I have to try to, it's hard to tell if there's any dirt on here. I want to try to clean it really good. I'm just going to use like isopropyl and like a little piece of microfiber or even a Q-tip, and try to make sure there's no dust on it, and then put my clear glass on, which I'm going to clean it as well with the microfiber. It's in the it's a little wrap, but who knows, it might have a little residue or something on it. Because see, before, when I had this with it totally naked like this, I could remove the lens and open the shutter on the mirror lock in there, which what that does, the mirror lock's actually for cleaning with this particular camera. It just flips it up and it's not actually making an exposure. And then you could clean off that cover glass, or in my case, the other glass right over the sensor. And I had never had to do that I can recall until I removed that cover filter. And when I did it, it was in the winter time, so I think the humidity was really low in the house because I had the heat on, and I think I even had my wood stove burning some wood because it was cold out, and I think that might have increased the static electricity because I was battling dust, which I managed to get it cleaned up pretty good. Well, darn, I don't know how good it shows up on here. This piece of glass I bought on eBay, which was not advertised as being for a Nikon D50, so it's not eBay's fault. It's not the seller's fault. This is 2 millimeters thick. I knew it might be too thick. I tried to get it in there, and I took a tiny little chip off the couple of corners of the glass. It didn't seem to have hurt the camera any, I hope. I don't think it did. So I'm going to be putting it back together without an internal filter. So it looks like I'm showing you how I did this the first time, just to make this a true full spectrum, completely naked, if you will. So when I opened it up originally, this little filter glass with the blue on it was in here in its little recess, and it was covered with these two pieces, and I just removed the glass, put these back on, put the camera back together. So without the piece of glass in there, it was very easy to put the 4 screws back in. It's just like I say, the only problem was the one I had was too thick. Okay, now as I'm putting this back together to put this shield panel back in, this left side of it has the connectors for the USB and power and stuff. So I have to kind of tuck this in under to get it to lay down. And this is also where I have this one ribbon that plugs in underneath this shield. So in order to put it back, I have to desolder it, and there's 2 points. There's a point there and a point there. So I have to get brave and see if I can do that. I've got a solder sucker tool, and we'll see what happens. So this is my solder sucker, solder removing tool. It's just a plunger. You press in, and then when you push this release button, it gets suction down here. So I'll heat up the solder and hopefully pull the piece of solder out. And I've got to do that to 2 spots. So what I ended up doing was gently lifting up on this as I heated the solder joint right here, and then again is the one there, and I was able to pick this up off of here. And then I should be able to find my connector for the ribbon and hopefully get my flash and autofocus back. So this tiny little ribbon here on the left slides into this connector, and then I've got to try to flip it over the little lever on it, which is very small, but I can do it with the screwdriver once I tuck it in there good and securely. Okay, so for my reassembly, what I did in order to make it easier to reconnect these 3 ribbons, the cables, I screwed in this upper right hand screw because it doesn't include this shield. This shield has the bottom left, the top left, and the bottom right, and that made it easier because it held it down steady. And then I also figured out that since I've got these other 2 screws, one here and one here, I could go ahead and put them on before I put the shield on, because there's just a hole through the shield where I did it, and I thought, well, I can do that now. And to say the least, it's pretty tedious to get these ribbons in there, but it's doable. I put on a couple pairs of reading glasses. I even tried this cheap magnifier that I bought someplace for a few bucks, and it actually helps a lot. So now I'm just going to put my shield back on, and then I'm going to decide whether I bother soldering that or not, because I'll see. I'm thinking about not soldering it and just leaving it connected with screws. We'll see if I change my mind. Now when you re-put in this bottom left hand screw, there are 2 very tiny wires going through here, and you just want to, I used a second little tiny screwdriver and held those wires over to the side to make sure I didn't accidentally pinch them underneath the screw. Okay, so now when I go to put this back panel on with the monitor, it's got a ribbon cable that connects just underneath the viewfinder. So I'll have to put that on, and then the screws on each side. Put a battery back in. It says I've got images available. Power it on. Says I'm good. There's something flashing, probably the clock. Yeah, the clock light is flashing, which just means I need to reset the date on my clock. That's no big deal. Takes picture. I don't have a lens on it. I got a picture. Now, since I've got it full spectrum, it messes with the color balance, so I have to play with that. But it's working.